Thank you very much. Last session on the last day is always a challenge. After today's talks, I decided at lunchtime that we would go for two goals. I'm going to have a presentation with no words on it, and I'm going to hopefully get a couple of laughs out of you between now and the end of the day. That being said, the topic is quite a challenging one, and you can go now if you like. Yeah, the topic's a quite challenging one. Thank you. The topic's a quite challenging one, and there's a bit of false pretenses here, because when I actually was approached by the conference to come and talk, they said, give us a couple of titles. So I sent them back two titles, one which was about fatigue management technologies, because we've just done a report for the Victorian government evaluating all of the commercial products and how regulators should integrate them into regulatory frameworks, blah, blah, blah. And I said, or I can talk about the work we've done on the parliamentary inquiry into FIFO-DIDO. And they wrote back and said the parliamentary inquiry would be great, but the title comes out managing fatigue and the parliamentary inquiry both at the same time. So if you have questions about fatigue management, ask them after I finish the presentation, if you're really bored with what I talk about in terms of the parliamentary inquiry. But first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk here. I feel a bit lost. I'm a social scientist, unashamedly, sitting in a room full of engineers and technology people. So that's going to be a challenge in and of itself. I have recently joined Central Queensland University. I run a large research institute, which is in Adelaide. CQU, in its ever-spreading footprint, has now decided to have campuses in every capital city of Australia, and Adelaide was the next one off the rank. I've been working with the mining industry, as was said, for over 20 years, and I have spent many years sitting on mine sites, initially helping people develop new rosters, many of them FIFO and DIDO rosters, and my first job in the mining industry was actually with Brambles back in the early to mid-90s, probably before some of your times, but Brambles developed a super auger, which was a great big corkscrew that used to pull the coal out once the overburden got too high. And they had a group of people who would do that, but the working time arrangement was such that they would go to a town with their wife and family and move every 6 months. And not surprisingly, the turnover rate was about 127% per year, and it took 3 months to train people. So they figured there was a bit of a problem, and we did a really innovative thing. We actually sat down to the employees and their wives and said, why do you keep quitting? And they said, well, when mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And the bottom line is that the wives just wouldn't accept the idea of picking up and shifting every 6 months. They just didn't buy it, and not surprisingly. And it's a really good example of what people talked about earlier today, the idea of the technology looks great, the income looked fantastic when the guys went home, but in practice it didn't work because nobody had really thought through the social and the cultural implications of the technology. So I guess I'd make the observation that I've been working with FIFO groups trying to understand the social and technical aspects and how they interact for about 20 years. And I'm going to make an anthropological observation here. Everybody's carrying on like FIFO and DIDO is this wonderful new phenomena that we've created. In fact, I'm going to refer you back to what is the vast majority of human experience with what we call WIWO, which is walk in, walk out, which is the hunter-gatherer societies. Groups of men have been going off to garner resources for as long as human society can remember. And in fact, it's only in the last 100 years that we haven't done that in most communities. The difference is that we lack now the social support mechanisms which many Indigenous communities and hunter-gatherer societies around the world have had for thousands of years. Interestingly, when you work, as I do, with many of the communities up in remote Australia, particularly Aboriginal communities, they don't blink an eye at the notion of FIFO. They've been pissing off for business for 2 weeks out of a month for as long as people can remember. So I actually think we've kind of got the debate wrong. But if you look at the last 20 or 30 years where we've evolved from urban manufacturing, maybe a little bit of shift work, but we go home with mum and dad, then it's really clear that FIFO has created a wicked problem. And I think the best quote I ever heard about wicked problems was by H.L. Mencken, who said, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's usually wrong, and it's generally proffered by senior management. And and he didn't actually put the last bit in, but I think that's it's worth thinking about that. Where people and communities are faced with wicked problems, what our socio-cultural analysis shows is that they respond to that in two very predictable ways. The first is what we call the Hanrahan response. We'll all be ruined. And what people do faced with a wicked problem is to catastrophise the outcomes. It's the end of the world as we know it on the planet. And again, when I talk about the parliamentary inquiry, you will see there is a whole category of people saying FIFO is the end of the world and we'll all be ruined. The other approach that humans take, and this is typically the one taken by the powerful or the dominant within the community, is to deny that the problem exists. That is, there is no alternative argument, or sometimes referred to as the Tina argument. So, based on what we understand from the cultural and the anthropological understandings of how people face wicked problems, I was asked to appear before the FIFO and Dido community committee, which the Parliament has been running for the last 12 months. That committee will hand out its results, so to speak, in March next year, or February, March next year. We decided that it would really, as researchers, be quite interesting to actually look at the body of data that had been presented to that parliamentary inquiry. And as researchers, we wanted to understand what information had been presented to the committee. And as a project over the last couple of months, we've had a bunch of graduate students voluntarily undertake a thematic and quantitative analysis of the submissions that have been made to the parliamentary inquiry, 216 in total. Some of them very long, some of them very short, many of them very passionate, and most of them fairly political. 7 of them were not made available to the general public, but of the 209 that have done, we've gone back and at least 6 of us have read every one of them, and then we've gone through and then tried to see what are the broad patterns and responses that the people in these parliamentary submissions have made. And part of our job here is to keep the bastards honest, to quote Don Chipp. That is, we want to make sure what comes out in the actual report is probably representative. For those of you who are interested, what I'm presenting today has now been written up as a paper, and we have actually sent that off to the parliamentary inquiry to make sure that they understand we've done this. But what I thought I'd do today is to spend a little bit of time and take you through some of the key themes that emerged from the parliamentary inquiry, and to see if we can put it into some kind of context. For many of you, you will be going back tomorrow or next week to organisations that will be forced to respond to this inquiry next year. And my greatest fear is that the short-term politics and the populism that dominates us at the moment in the Parliament could actually lead to what I would call suboptimum outcomes. That's an engineer's term for fuck up. And I think it's really, really important that when these inquiries come out and your organisations start to talk about how are we going to manage FIFO, what are we going to do, what are the consequences, how do we manage it, we need a framework for having a discussion about that as a community. So I'm going to give you some big picture results, what I think are some of the take-home messages from the majority of the submissions. And then what I'd like to do is to suggest what I think is a balanced way forward that acknowledges that we don't know everything, in fact we don't know much at all, and that populist responses could actually bugger the industry and ruin the lives of many people around Australia. So, big picture data from it. Of the 209 submissions that were made to the parliamentary inquiry, 197 of them lacked any empirical evidence to support their claims. That's pretty amazing. And I'm not passing that as a judgment to say that people didn't necessarily report data. In many cases, they were talking about issues for which we clearly don't have data. But there were many examples where we do have data, and that was assiduously avoided. What was interesting, of the 12 papers that actually cited data, we actually went back and then checked the source data that the people had quoted in their papers. And surprise, surprise, sometimes what had been said in the paper that was cited was at best an optimistic interpretation of what had been said in the original data, or in many cases they hadn't said that, and in some cases they'd said exactly the opposite. And a lot of the research literature that had been cited in good scholarly university type styles, when we went back and looked at them, they weren't actually scholarly reports, they were grey literature, or they were consultants' reports commissioned by the particular lobby group who was presenting to the parliamentary inquiry. And particularly for the activists in the game, there was a tendency to make their submissions look scholarly and have lots of citations and references and what I would call ritual data and scholarship, but very, very few of them actually had any data. And what was interesting, not one of the submissions provided what we would call mixed data, to say on one hand certain people say this, but on the other hand there is conflicting data. We know, having looked at that research, that every one of the topics that's raised, there is conflicting evidence about this topic. The people opposed to FIFO and the people avidly supporting it all refused to acknowledge arguments on the other side. So what we decided to do, having looked at the quality of the evidence, which in scientific terms we classified as level 4, which is engineering term for crap, we then decided we would then try to categorise the topics and themes that came out of it. And we saw that there were two broad classes of themes that came out of the submissions, and they were broadly, and not surprisingly, the economic consequences of FIFO and DIDO, and they were the social impacts of FIFO-DIDO. And if we focus first on the economic consequences of it, we then did a thematic analysis, looked at all the themes and counted the number of times each of those themes emerged, and then broadly divided it into those that were for it or saw the positive benefits of FIFO from an economic perspective, those that saw the negative, and those that saw a mixed or neutral position. There were no themes identified in the neutral or mixed position, as I said also. What was interesting, however, that the analysis showed that about half of the community presentations to the committee said the social impacts were very positive, and the other half said they were incredibly negative. And when we broke that down further, they fell into three broad categories. The first was that the most common economic themes were the advantages, obviously, of FIFO and DIDO in enabling organisations to manage skill shortages, particularly in the construction phase of organisations. The second factor, the most common factor to emerge, was what we referred to as the divisive combination of both the positive and the negative effects on a local economy. In the same way as Australians and our governments have been talking about the two-speed or the patchwork economy for the nation, we saw that reflected even within the small towns like Moranbah or those kind of places. That is, there were people, for example, in the Pilbara who were train drivers who bought 5 or 6 houses before the boom hit, and those houses which they bought for 100 grand were now worth $1.5 million, and they saw it as a huge economic advantage. There were people who were trying to employ hairdressers or people to work in the petrol station who saw it as a very negative consequence. So what was quite interesting is that we saw the macro and the micro reflected simultaneously. So we saw, even within quite small mining communities, big winners and really big losers as a result of it. And that has turned out to be very corrosive in the submissions to it. That has eaten away at the social capital and the fabric of many of those communities. The third area that emerged was the negative effects of the increased demand on local infrastructure by FIFO and DIDO people. Because of the way the census works and how you count how many people live there, in many cases up in the northwest or in the Bowen Basin, you could have 10 or 12,000 people more that you had to provide services through local government and health than was actually on the books and that you were getting money from government for. It was really clear that around about 70% of the discussion and the submissions focused on the economic aspects, and about 30% addressed the social consequences. However, That was quite interesting difference between the economic effects, which I said before were split 50-50, strongly for or strongly against. When we looked at the social impacts of FIFO and DIDO, over 95% of the submissions identified negative consequences. There were almost no people identifying positive social impacts of FIFO or DIDO, other than a couple of cheeky blokes who said it was really good to spend 2 weeks away from the missus. And that was brought up by some of the women who run the Mining Matters website, which was kind of amusing at the time. But it went to demonstrate that by and large the social impacts were broadly negative. We've taken a more detailed analysis of that, which is in the paper, which I'm happy to send to people, but we won't go through that today. But what's really clear from the submissions is that people are incredibly passionate about this topic, and it's going to be very hard for people to find a common middle ground, I suspect, once this report comes out, and we are required as a nation and at a community level to actually respond to it. And I think there's some really interesting reasons for that. I think the fundamental problem is that the debate is driven by values, and that there's one group of people whose values don't necessarily reflect other people's in the debate. And I can see this, for example, if you go to Dicehart, and there are people there who bemoan the 12-hour shift and FIFO-DIDO communities and the loss of our community and the cricket teams aren't there. And then you talk to the Y-gens who go, I ain't living in bumfuck central Queensland and my wife has a job and there's no jobs for her in this town, and the opportunity cost for me to live there and her not work means I'd need about $300,000 a year for us after tax to be revenue positive on this. So there were quite different value systems driving it, and in many cases they reflected either cultural or quite broad demographic differences. Many of the arguments and debates put forward, as we've heard today, are predicated on the fact that mum stays at home and dad goes to work. Rio have been brilliant in some of their minds by actually hiring couples rather than hiring individuals and then trying to work out what will make mum happy or not. And I can tell you, for a lot of the wives of the professional guys, working in the local supermarket or coffee shop wears off really fast. We need to find good professional jobs for those women, and I think what Rio's doing is impressive. There were very few commentaries that I said that provided strong evidence, and I think one of the take-home messages from this is that even though it was passionate and heartfelt, there wasn't a lot of fact on the ground. And the other thing is, even as a researcher I understand, is we don't have 10 years to sit around and try and work out what will be the best process that we should follow with this. So I think the challenge facing us once the results of these come out and we are forced to respond to this parliamentary inquiry is how do we develop good evidence-based policy in the short term in the absence of a strong pre-existing knowledge base. And I think there's a number of things that we can learn from the process that our group has been through. The first is, having talked to a lot of industry and academic colleagues around Australia in the last 6 months over this issue, I think there's a number of sensible things that we can do. The first is, ain't nobody sharing. There's a huge amount of practice and what we would politely refer to as action research going on, as I said, by Rio or BHP, about ways to manage FIFO, ways to manage the fatigue associated with commutes, but nobody's sharing it. And I think one of the first and the most important things we do is we need to have some methodology for at least working out what everybody else is doing, so we can at least find those attempts that have been made, what does and what doesn't work, and we can at least have some repository where you can go and look and say, well, here are the ways people are dealing with this issue. Have a look, go and talk to these people, see what you can find or not find and what they think works or not works. I think the other thing that we need to be able to do is that we need to have some process that enables us to determine what is reasonable for a community around the establishment of a mine from a social perspective. And I think what's really interesting at the moment is we have very rigorous financial or economic and environmental impact assessments that are required to be done prior to the establishment of a mine. And depending on which jurisdiction you look in Australia, we have a patchwork set of vaguely defined processes for looking at the social impact of establishing and running a mine. But when you compare the rigorousness of that it pales in comparison to what we require from people from an economic or an environmental perspective. And I'm quite libertarian in my views, and I don't think there is a right answer to this question, that it should be FIFO or it shouldn't be. And I think, personally, an informed consent model, that is, at least if you're going to employ people in those manners, they need to know what the risks are. That is, it's a 35% increase in the likelihood that you'll be paying alimony within 5 years. And we need to educate you so you understand the difference between income and discretionary income after you have 2 lots of alimony to pay each month. So there are a whole lot of challenges that we need to do. I don't think we as a community should be telling people what to do, but I think we have a responsibility to enable them to make an informed decision. And I think the most suitable way forward is to say we need to develop a standardised and rigorous social impact assessment methodology in the same way as we require people to do a financial and an environmental impact assessment. But that it should be a rigorous process in the same way that the financial and environmental impact assessments are. And I think the goal should be that when a community sits down, and the state government and the federal government and everybody sits down around the table, then people should be able to understand within a risk-based framework what are the advantages, what are the risks, what are the potential mitigations that we can put into place, and we should approach it in the same way that we would approach a financial or an environmental decision. The challenge, however, is that's a bit harder and woollier, and there's a whole bunch of engineering and mechanical guys out there, and that's a bit frightening. And I think, unashamed editorialising here, is there is a role for people who have background in the social sciences and cultural re-engineering to be able to assist organisations and government with this process, and to ensure that the social impact assessments that are done before and the risk mitigations that are required to manage those social risks are also followed through, and the companies are actually required to do what they say they do. So, for example, you can go and look at a lot of the social impact assessments that have been done in the resource-intensive areas, and the companies promised all sorts of stuff and then never delivered it. Now, did they not deliver it because they didn't want to? No, sometimes it was because the council actually decided we don't need a support group for wives of FIFO miners. What we actually need is a new gymnasium or a new swimming pool or something that the mayor can put their name on, or those kind of things, and all the normal political processes that go on. But I think possibly if we develop some kind of social impact assessment methodology that was rigorous and then to the extent possible was able to stand to the side and could be followed up and organisations held accountable to what they'd committed to in that social impact assessment, we would give communities at least the opportunity to make an informed decision. So I think, in essence, we need a more comprehensive, evidence-based and standardised social impact assessment process at the national level, and that the goal of that process will be to enable communities and organisations to come together to make decisions in the context of what I would call broadly informed consent. But I also think in parallel to that, we need to have a more systematic national approach to collecting the necessary evidence to inform those social impact assessments, but to realise that that's not going to happen tomorrow, and that we may have to allow lots of people to try stuff out on the condition that they actually put that information into the public domain and share it. Or we say, we need a bit of a suck it and see approach, guys. We need to be able to say what is the outcome. So, I think given the importance of the mining boom to the Australian economy and the importance of ensuring that we optimise the benefits and minimise the costs, that a small investment in an action research program where we're actually out in the field, not sitting in laboratories or pontificating from the beanbag, as university academics are prone to do, we can actually quite quickly build up an evidence base that will enable people to make more and more informed decisions about how to go forward over the FIFO and DIDO issues, and particularly because my personal belief is that FIFO and DIDO is here to stay, both because people want to do it and it makes complete rational sense, particularly in the construction phase, etc., etc. But I do think we have to accept the fact that there are consequences. We know something about those, we could know a lot more, and there's a lot that we could do that we're not currently doing to mitigate those risks. So, I hope that some of this has been useful to you. I would like you, if you go back to your organisations and have a think about this and think there's at least some vague merit in what we're talking about here, which is that I think the issue is to move towards a risk-based informed consent model, to require mining developments to undertake a rigorous social impact assessment that enables organisations and communities to identify and quantify the risks and controls specific to any proposed development. And I think this will help ensure that the community understands the breadth of the issues that they are facing when it comes to FIFO Dido. And it increases the chances of development on the basis of that informed consent. So the last thing we want is emotional responses whereby mines lose their social licence to operate. And we have seen those kind of discussions happen in communities, not so much in Australia, but in other parts of the world. And that spells economic disaster to everybody. The second is, I would encourage you and your organisations to participate and get involved in a multidisciplinary collaborative research program that will help us underpin to the evaluation and approval of social impact assessments. At the moment, the people who are doing all the data collection are the people who are looking at the negative consequences of it. I think there's a time for a call to arms to the industry to say there are a lot of advantages to it too, and if you don't get that evidence on the table and you don't work and collaborate, I think the smart money knows that it's on one hand and on the other hand problem and that there's no simple fix. What deeply concerns me is the fact that a lot of the industry is pretending that the problem will go away, and you're going to need some data to counter the evidence that's going to come that's going to be biased, as is always. People always collect data that reinforces their initial prejudice, particularly in the social sciences. So I think it's a call to arms to say the way we'll solve this is if we actually work together and try and undertake these kinds of initiatives collaboratively and in good faith. So hopefully you take that message home. Nobody's fallen asleep just yet, and I'm pleased to notice that from sitting at the back, I noticed that just under half the audience was Facebooking or LinkedIning or emailing during most of the day, and I've been assiduously watching, and I don't think anybody's done that a lot, or if you did it really well, so I didn't see. So thank you very much. Hopefully some of this has been useful. There's been an email up there if you want to contact me. It's easy. I don't have a business card because my kids told me recently, who are 18 and 20, that's so 20th century, Dad. So what do they say? Google me. So thank you very much. Were there any questions? Any comments? No, everyone wants to. Oh, one over here.
You speak of the FIFO Dido and communities. Western Australia is probably a little bit different, where we have remote camps away from communities. How is that falling into the research?
You would have seen one of the sites, one of the pictures I had up there. What's really interesting is the people who design and build the camps in Western Australia. Do you know who it typically is? It's the same company that designs prisons and immigration detention centres. And they all look exactly the same, and then you go, why is it that the miners keep acting like damn prisoners and refugees and getting involved with all the same issues and problems? People, it's actually relatively cheap to sit down and design communities of remote camps that cost fractions, a little bit more, but you actually organise them in ways that lead to better community, less crowding behaviour, much less drinking and fighting and all of the problems that go on. So, and again, I think it goes back to this issue of the engineer and the psychologist trying to have a conversation. And I'm actually involved in the first project that's starting to address these issues to say, if we were going to design a mining camp that's remote from the community, how could we design a really good one that takes into account all the stuff we know? But if you go onto a lot of the mining camps, now it's hard to work out which is your actual donga because they're all lined up. And when you do it, you say, why did you do it in that grid pattern? Why didn't you do it in, for example, concentric radiating circles, which is the normal form of human development? Well, we saved 30 metres of bitumen that way. you know, in the overall scheme of things, these are trivial costs. But again, nobody bought the social scientists and the anthropologists and the community development people in to say, how would you actually build this from scratch right to minimise the harm associated with having a large pool of testosterone clustered in a very small space? I agree, and hence my question earlier today. But I think that the issue for me is it's short-term costs. But when you actually look in terms of staff turnover, accident injury, the morale on the campsite, all of those kind of things, but nobody's measuring those. And as if you live in high engineering culture, you know if it's in a spreadsheet, it's true. And if it's on a PowerPoint presentation, it's gospel. And if I can't put it in a spreadsheet, it doesn't exist. And I think those kind of cultural biases about what is true and what counts are really important discussions in organisations. I think you could probably design much better communities. You've only got to look at the sex worker stuff that's going up on in central Queensland, up in the Pilbara. We have fly-in, fly-out prostitutes now. It's amazing. And I'm sure you're all aware of the interesting challenges that provides when people come back to their wives and families in Perth or Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or Adelaide. Were there any other questions? I think we're going to have a panel session now and let you all engage. Thank you all very much.